Breaking tonight, just months after the president celebrates the return of a U.S. soldier held hostage and ultimately traded for 5 top terror leaders. The Army announces that soldier is being charged with desertion and more. And tonight, the political fallout is getting dramatic. Welcome to a busy night here on the Kelly File, everyone. I'm Megyn Kelly. Then Private First Class Bo Bergdahl went missing in 2009, disappearing from his post in Afghanistan and showing up later in a Taliban hostage video. Then last spring, a dramatic hostage trade. A shaky Bergdahl is released, but it came with a controversial price, as not 1, but 5 Taliban commanders were released from Guantanamo Bay prison in exchange for Bergdahl's freedom. Bergdahl's parents were even invited to make a Rose Garden appearance alongside the President of the United States, where they celebrated their son's release and shared a greeting in Arabic.
I called Bob and Janny Bergdahl and told them that after nearly 5 years in captivity, their son Bo is coming home.
I'd like to say to Bo right now, who's having trouble speaking English, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Zayabayem. I'm your father, Bo.
Within days, we started hearing troubling stories about exactly how Bergdahl left his base in the dead of night, after asking his team leader for help mailing his computer and his belongings back home, and inquiring as to what would happen to him if his military gear turned up missing. And after administration officials suggested Bergdahl had served with, quote, honor and distinction before going missing, the Kelly File had an exclusive interview with 6 of his platoon mates who had some very different feelings about the man for whom they once risked their own lives. Raise your hand if you think he deserted. Raise your hand if you have some question about whether he deserted.
This is not about politics. This is about the fact that Bergdahl walked away from us, went to try to find the Taliban, and we know that for a fact, and we were all there. And there's not one person you could find who would say that they don't believe that. At least who was there. He's not a hero, and he did not serve with distinction, and that's a spit in the face to everyone who joined the Army and anyone who died looking for him.
Now that the suspicions of those men have been suggested to be right by the Army, we are again hearing questions about whether we paid too high a price in this deal. We have got an all-star lineup for you tonight on this story as incoming White House Communications Director Jen Psaki weighs in. We've also got former White House Press Secretary Dana Perino, combat veteran Pete Hegseth, but we begin tonight with our chief White House correspondent, Ed Henry, with the very latest. Ed?
Megyn, good evening. Let me take you behind the scenes. It's interesting. The White House made sure this was announced by the Army hours after Josh Earnest had his daily briefing with reporters. So he did not have to react and answer to what came before, what the former fellow soldiers of Bo Bergdahl had said in that interview with you, what was said in the Rose Garden. And then tomorrow, the president travels to Alabama. That means there's no on-camera briefing here at the White House for Josh Earnest. They're clearing the decks here so they do not have to answer some of those tough questions you mentioned. Let's also remember earlier in the administration, both the then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton opposed the heavy price on this swap, although as she opened up her book tour, Hillary Clinton sort of flip-flopped and backpedaled and suggested that she backed the president in this swap for Bergdahl. Listen.
If you look at what the factors were going into the decision, of course there are competing interests and values. I mean, one of our values is we bring everybody home off the battlefield the best we can. It doesn't matter how they ended up in a prisoner of war situation.
Doesn't matter how it ended up tonight. Speaker John Boehner is rejecting that idea. He says, of course, Bo Bergdahl is innocent until proven guilty, but Boehner goes on to say, quote, my chief concern remains President Obama's decision to release 5 hardened terrorists with no guarantees that they won't return to the battlefield. I believe it made Americans less safe. That from Speaker John Boehner. The significance there is, let's also not forget that the reason why Congress got so angry at the beginning of this is they were cut out of the loop, and the law said they had to be informed of a swap like this. Congress, Democrats and Republicans, were not informed of that.
Ed, thank you. Well, in the days after this controversial prisoner trade, the administration went on defense, with several officials suggesting that the former Taliban captive served with honor and distinction, while others questioned the account from the soldiers, the platoon mates who had served with Bergdahl and were there when he left.
He served the United States with honor and distinction.
So the negotiation to obtain Sergeant Bergdahl's release is not a breach of that policy of not negotiating with terrorists.
It is absolutely consistent with decades, and I venture centuries, because we've had more than two now in the United States, of past practice when it comes to prisoners of war and exchanges of prisoners.
Does the State Department consider Sergeant Bergdahl to be a deserter?
The State Department, no, Lucas.
The guys on national television last night, his squad mates, platoon mates, were not corrupt.
I'm saying we don't know the fact pattern yet here. We don't. Nobody knows exactly what happened that night.
Well, I think that his squad mates have the best indication of what happened.
I don't think that's the case.
We do not leave anybody wearing the American uniform behind. We had a prisoner of war whose health had deteriorated, and we were deeply concerned about, and we saw an opportunity and we seized it, and I make no apologies for that.
Dana Perino was co-host of The Five, and she served as White House press secretary under President George W. Bush. And Pete Hegseth is the CEO of Concerned Veterans for America and a Fox News contributor. We begin tonight with Pete. Your feelings on learning that he will, in fact, be charged?
I'm proud of the Army. I'm proud of them stepping up and living by a code, pertaining to a code. They were under either explicit or implicit pressure to take a different stance on this. But when they looked at the facts of 2009, what the platoon mates understood is that Bo Bergdahl walked off that base and deserted his unit. And the larger charge is not just desertion, Megan. It's endangering the lives of his fellow soldiers. Men died searching for Bo Bergdahl. So he's been charged. He'll have his day in court. He hasn't yet been found guilty. But the Army believes it has the evidence and had the courage to step forward, despite the political pressure, despite political top-level people saying he served with honor and distinction, to bring this charge and really bring honor back to this situation, because men died looking for Bo Bergdahl when he went looking for the Taliban.
Mm-hmm. And they said that certainly Army resources were diverted when they were looking for him, and so other soldiers did not have the cover that they would normally have had, and men died in that process. That's been documented. But Pete, the president has said all along, we leave no soldier behind, and you heard him there. I stand by the decision.
Well, he has to stand by the decision at this point. Secretary Clinton said that it doesn't matter how he got there. It does. She famously also said, what difference does it make? And what I would say, it makes a big difference how you become a prisoner of war. Ask a lot of people. Ask John McCain, who was shot down, who was fighting and pursuing the enemy. In this case, Bo Bergdahl allegedly walked off the base, and his platoon mates understood that. That is a critical factor, especially, Megan, when you're willing to break decades and centuries of what you're willing to say publicly about concessions to the enemy, negotiating with the enemy, and you're willing to turn over 5, not just terrorist all-stars, terrorist leaders who are under house arrest for a year, and will now likely go back to Afghanistan and seek to rejoin the fight, seek to join ISIS and kill more Americans. That trade was deadly, will have deadly and historic consequences, because of the way they view Bo Bergdahl, they had to have known in 2009, Megan. Everyone knew that there was the there. To stand and say honor and distinction was to stand affront the facts.
And his platoon mates did not appreciate that characterization. Pete, good to see you.
Thank you.
Want to get to